If Sleeping Beauty came out today, people would talk about it like it was revolutionary. You'd see thousands of hours of video essays about how this film was so new and fresh and feminist, especially if it came from a company other than Disney. It's a fantasy world full of women. This is what the girlies want. This is the female gaze. It's women of different shapes and sizes and ages and personalities. The prince is just here to be a love interest. It's really about the gorgeous female villain and the lovely damsel in distress, and most of all, the three middle-aged women that lead the film.
It looks awful. That's because it's on you, dear.
The discourse would be loud and opinionated, and I really think very little of it would be about how old-fashioned this movie is, about how this film could have been made 50 years ago. I think there would be no doubt in anybody's mind that this film had been made specifically for this moment in time, for 2026. There are no capital S strong female characters here, nobody annoying and awkward and adorkable. And of course you'd have a whole second set of video essays throwing a tantrum about how this was the woke agenda, because what do you mean I have to watch a movie with women in it who are fat and old? Both? It's so forced that they had to nerf the prince, that they had to make him weak and emasculated just so that the women could save the day. And that's before we even get to the kiss. That kiss would be discourse to death. I'm being very sassy, but that discourse would partially be justified, I think. Sleeping Beauty is an extraordinary film, and maybe it was ahead of its time, whatever that means. But I think a lot of the discourse would be projection, right? It usually is. Disney's princess canon has always been a magnet for cultural commentary, and if you look at the discourse over decades, you see big pendulum swings back and forth, and movies take a long time to make. And Disney is a pretty slow-moving company, so it always lags behind the cultural conversation. Sometimes people just want whatever Disney hasn't made lately. If you look at Disney over the past 10 years, you see a pretty similar art style. You see these computer-generated character designs that are pretty similar. And so if they gave us something different, people would be really excited. Disney animated films used to have a ton of romance. Over the past 10 years, that's been kind of rare. People are hungry for it. So if Disney released a film that foregrounded romance, I think people would be really excited. But at different points in the company's history, including when this movie was first released, that's not what people were starving for. There was a time when this character design and this romantic storyline, that was the sad, tired old archetype that had been done to death. I think you can make a great case that Sleeping Beauty is revolutionary and feminist, and you can make an equally great case that it is regressive and sexist. Sometimes these movies become battlefields of discourse in a way that totally obscures the work itself. That happens a lot to princess movies, and I think it's happened to Sleeping Beauty. I think nobody really remembers what's actually in this movie. If it's been a long time since you've seen this movie, or you've never seen it, I highly recommend giving it a go. It's, first of all, amazing. It's a great movie. And I think you just might be surprised what you see. Even the fact that I'm calling it a Disney princess film, that I am now, in hindsight, decades later, grouping it together with these other films that it's not really connected to, even that puts it in a box and puts expectations on it that the movie might not necessarily match. Princess Aurora looks like she fits in very well in the Disney princess lineup, and she seems to group very well with the other princesses of her era. I just did a video about the Disney princess lineup where I grouped her together with Snow White and Cinderella. I called them together the classic princesses. And that seems like it makes sense, you know, those three are fairly similar in personality, in character design. They're from similar types of fairy tales. Their films were made closer together than they were to the other princess films. But when you really look at Aurora as a character in her movie of origin, when you look at Sleeping Beauty, it stands out from the rest of those princess films. The other princess films have a lot in common in terms of story structure, in terms of plot, that hers kind of doesn't. She actually really stands out from this lineup because unlike all of the others, she's not the protagonist of her movie. I guess you could say Jasmine isn't the protagonist of Aladdin, because that's Aladdin, but you can make a good case that she's a secondary protagonist. She has her own scenes that follow her journey. She has a beginning, middle, and end. But when it comes to Aurora, it'd be hard to make a case that she's one of the 2 or 3 main characters. She's on screen for less than 20 minutes, including the scenes where she's a baby, and she speaks, famously, 18 lines of dialogue in the entire film. The art and advertisements for the movie seem to position her as the main character, and obviously she's the titular character, but is she the protagonist of Sleeping Beauty? I guess the actual question is, if it's not Aurora, then who is the protagonist of Sleeping Beauty? I'm so glad you asked. Let's talk about it. If we're going to talk about story structure, we should talk about source material, because of course Sleeping Beauty is not an original Disney invention. It's based on Fairytale, so let's look at the choices that were made in adaptation. Since we're talking about fairy tales, a couple things to keep in mind that you probably already know, but just a reminder. There is no original. There is no such thing as the first original Sleeping Beauty story. If somebody tries to tell you what happens in the original Sleeping Beauty, they are trying to sell you something. When we're talking about this type of old fairy tale, what we're actually looking at are a bunch of different people telling stories, usually like grandmothers at bedtime. And they're telling stories over and over again, and those get repeated and passed down, and then they mix and merge with other cultural traditions, and they morph, and then at some point somebody collects them and maybe writes them down and publishes them, and that gets moved around, and then it moves back into the oral tradition, and that repeats multiple times, and finally we arrive at something like the version we have today. And now here, in hindsight, we look back at that chain and we apply the label Sleeping Beauty. So when we look back at the history of this tale, our easiest touch points are those written collections, but we are going to resist. We are going to valiantly resist the strong temptation to treat the written versions as more real and more authoritative than the oral versions. What we typically call Sleeping Beauty in our artificial human-made categorization is a line of fairy tales that originates in France that's about a princess who falls into an enchanted sleep, and then her curse is broken and she wakes up and then gets married and lives happily ever after. As far as written versions go, we can definitely trace this back to 14th century France, probably existed way before, but we can start in 14th century France because it was written down in this massive poem, in this like courtly chivalric romance. It's called Perséphone, or as I call it in my head, Purse Forest. And it has a bunch of different stories within it, but one of them is about a princess called Zeladine who gets a splinter of flax in her finger that causes her to go into an enchanted sleep, and then she is saved by her prince and lives happily ever after. So the story is there, it's bouncing around in different poems, and then in the 17th century it gets framed as its own fairy tale and put in a collection of fairy tales called the Pentameron, which are by this guy Basile, or Basil, as I call him in my head. And in the Pentameron, the story is called Sun, Moon, and Talia, and it's really wild. If you have heard people try to tell you about the original Sleeping Beauty, they're probably talking about this one just because it's the wildest. So in this story, once upon a time, there's a great lord and he has a daughter called Talia, and then these wise men predict that Talia is one day going to get a splinter of flax and die. And Talia's father is pretty upset and he's like, there should be no flax anywhere on my estate. And then some years later, Talia is a young woman and she's in the castle and she looks out the window and she sees this old woman spinning. And she's never seen that before, so she's very curious and she goes out to check it out, and oh my gosh, she gets the splinter of flax and she falls down dead. And you might be thinking, I've heard stories before. I know how this works. That old woman was an evil witch in disguise, right? And no, this was a complete accident. This woman is as surprised as anybody that this has happened. If I may quote the text, and the quotes are always really funny because not only is this like a 17th century fairy tale collection, but also the translations I'm using are from like the 1920s, so they're also really weird. So the old woman sees Talia drop down dead and she's very afraid, and when the affrighted old woman beheld this, she hastened down the stairs and is hastening still. Talia's father is of course super sad, but he does not bury Talia because I guess you just don't do that in a fairy tale. He does not put her on a bed, he puts her on a chair, like a velvet throne. It's a nice chair, but still, he's like propping the corpse up on a chair, I guess, and it shuts her in the house and leaves. We don't see him again. After a time, I don't know if this is like a day or 100 years, after some time, a king is out hunting and he stumbles across the house. And this is also an accident. This guy has nothing to do with anything. But he finds the house and he's checking it out, and he finds Talia propped up on her chair, and she's not gross. Okay. It is here where the story tells us she seems to be in some sort of enchanted sleep. And the king sees her and he's like, wow, she's so hot. And let me just hit you with another quote. Ahem. Crying aloud, he beheld her charms, and felt his blood course hotly through his veins in contemplation of so many charms, and he lifted her in his arms, and carried her to a bed, whereon he gathered the first fruits of love, and leaving her upon the bed, returned to his own kingdom, where, in the pressing business of his realm, he for a time thought no more about this incident. Me when I have pressing business of the realm and think no more of this incident. So then 9 months later, Talia has twins. I did not skip anything here. Like, this is the next sentence. There is not even a paragraph break. Talia has now delivered twin babies, a boy and a girl. And they're hungry and trying to feed and not having any luck nursing because of how their mom is in an enchanted sleep, and so she's not helpful. And one of them tries to latch on her finger and sucks the splinter out of her finger. And then the curse is broken. Talia wakes up and she looks down and she's got 2 babies on her lap and she's like, oh my God, this is amazing. Like, this could not have worked out any better. This is perfect. I love babies. And she scoops them up and nurses them properly, and she loves them, and she names them Sun and Moon. And then, quote, in the meanwhile, the king remembered Talia. So he goes back to the house, and he comes in just in time to see her with the 2 babies. And he's like, oh my God, this is so perfect. This could not have worked out any better. And he's like, hello, young lady. It is I, the father of your children. And she's like, amazing. It's so good to meet you. This is so great. And they, what does it say? Their friendship was knitted with tighter bonds, and I actually don't even know if that's a euphemism or not. He stays for a couple of days, all 4 of them in the house together. They're super happy, and then he's like, I gotta go.
Okay, I'm gonna go.
And so he goes home to his castle and his wife. Yes, the king has a wife, and yes, we are learning about it right now. So that was the first part of the story, which is, I guess, recognizable as a Sleeping Beauty tale. And then we go into the second part of the story, where the queen, the king's current wife, the jealous queen, tries to kill Talia and her children. First, she tries to have the children cooked into a feast and fed to the king. She thinks she does it, but actually the cook does not want to participate in this, so he hides the babies and cooks lamb instead. And then she tries to throw Talia into a fire. But finally, the king catches on to what's going on, and he comes home, and he's like, this is no good. So he throws his wife into the fire, so then he can marry Talia, and they all live happily ever after. The moral of the story, according to Basile, is, he whom fortune favoreth, even in sleep, good reigneth for him. I don't think that's the moral of the story, but I'm not the author. So yeah, I guess we have basically the Sleeping Beauty story. She has a run-in with some fiber equipment that causes her to go into an enchanted sleep. And then she is woken up, indirectly, she is woken up by the prince's love. And then she lives happily ever after. And we have a couple other elements that will still pop up. We have the idea that her death was foretold when she was a baby. And we do technically have fairies in this version. Literally in one line, they pop up. If you were wondering, when Talia delivers the twins, like how they got so far as to even be sucking on her finger, if you wondered that, that's because of fairies. Quote, they were attended by 2 fairies who came to that palace and put them at their mother's breasts. I guess they did not do a very good job, but they at least got the babies as far as her lap, so that's progress. And in this story, Talia is the titular role. Okay, she and her 2 kids are the names that make up the title of the story. Talia's father and the king she marries and even the jealous queen, they don't even get names, but she gets a name. But she doesn't do much, right? She doesn't do much of her own accord. Things very much happen to her. So let's move on and talk about another version. Let's talk about the Charles Perrault version. The Perrault fairy tales are really important landmarks in the landscape of the history of fairy tales, and they are often the ones that people reach for when they are making modern day versions of fairy tales. So like Disney's Cinderella is specifically based on the Perrault version of Cinderella. Perrault's version is called The Sleeping Beauty in the Woods, and it goes like this, okay? Once upon a time, a king and queen have their long-awaited daughter and hold a great big christening celebration for her, and they invite all of the fairies of the realm to be her godmothers. And there are 7 fairies of the realm, and they all come, and the king gives them a gift of gold. And then an old fairy shows up, which is very surprising because she wasn't invited. And she was not invited because, and I quote, "For the last 50 years, she had never come out of the tower in which she lived, and everybody believed her either dead or under some spell." And, okay, who among us? Who among us? The king hurries up and lays another place for her, but oh my gosh, he only has 7 gifts of gold. He only brought 7 gifts of gold, so he does not have a gift of gold for the old fairy. And so now she's really ticked off. And one of the other fairies, the like good younger fairies, this is so hard when they don't have names. She sees the writing on the wall. She sees where this is going, and she like steps back and hides. And now it's gift giving time. All of the fairies are going to bestow a magical gift upon the princess because this is the custom of fairies in those times. And the first 6 fairies all give good gifts. They give the gifts of beauty and song and proficiency with musical instruments, which is a different gift than a good singing voice, and grace and dance and cleverness. And then the old fairy gives a gift of one day the princess pricking her finger on a spindle and dying, which was a bad gift. And everyone's upset about that. But then the fairy that hung back, she pops back out and she's like, I have a gift now. She's like, unfortunately, I don't have the power to cancel this curse, but I can modify it. So she will prick her finger on the spindle, but instead of death, she will fall into an enchanted sleep, and that will last 100 years. And at the end of 100 years, a king's son will come and wake her. So it's fine. The king forbids all spindles in the house, and the princess grows up, and when she is 15 or 16, the king and queen are out. At the time, they're just out at one of their pleasure houses. The princess is playing and exploring the castle, and she goes up to a tower and she sees this old woman spinning, and she's never seen this before, so she's very curious, and she goes to check it out, and she pricks her finger, and oh my gosh, she falls down dead. And you might be thinking, oh, but is this woman the evil old fairy in disguise? No, she's not. This is also an accident. This is a random old lady. Why she is up in this tower in this house spinning, when we learned one paragraph ago that spindles were prohibited on pain of death? On pain of death. I can't tell you, but the princess is clearly alive. She's breathing. She's just in an enchanted sleep. So the king lays her on a bed. Good choice of furniture. The good fairy knows that the princess will wake up in 100 years, but figures she might be alarmed when she wakes up alone in 100 years. So she puts everybody else to sleep. She puts all of the staff and courtiers of the castle in an enchanted sleep as well, including the princess's dog, which we are learning about in this moment. The princess has a little dog named Puff, who is curled up with her on her bed. So everyone goes to sleep except the king and queen, who just leave.
I should get going.
And they prohibit anyone from going near the castle, and for good measure, the good fairy has a dense forest grow around the castle. And she stays there for 100 years. And 100 years later, presumably, the king and queen have long since died. I don't know. 100 years later, a king's son is out hunting, and he stumbles across this castle. He's curious about it, but none of his people from his kingdom seem to know what's up. But there's a peasant there who knows the tales that have been passed down and explains that there's a princess in there. And the prince is like, And the peasant's like, yeah, the thing we know about her is that she's like super beautiful. And the prince is like, I'm listening. And the peasant is like, and yes, after 100 years, she will be woken from her enchanted sleep by a prince. And the prince is like, that's crazy, I'm a prince. He goes to find her, and the forest parts for him, not for his companions. So he goes in there alone, and he walks through the creepy castle of all of these sleeping people who just like drop to the ground in the midst of whatever they were doing. And he makes his way up to the tower, and he sees the princess, and he's like, oh my God, she's so hot. And he kneels down next to her just as she wakes up. The princess woke, and looking at him with a glance more tender than a moment's acquaintance would seem to warrant, "Is that you, my prince?" said she. "How long you have kept me waiting." It's actually kind of adorable. They are immediately obsessed with each other, and they sit there in the tower talking for 4 hours, and they decide they must have been fated to be together. And the princess even says that she recognized the prince because when she was sleeping, she dreamed of a man, and she's like, it was you. They have a great feast because the staff is all awake now, so they can prepare a feast. And then the castle chaplain marries them, and they spend the night together. And then in the morning, the prince is like, I have to go.
I should go.
The prince goes home to his parents, the king and queen, in their castle, and does not tell them about his new wife. He's like, yeah, I was out hunting. It was fun. It was whatever. And the king's like, oh, okay. And the queen's like, you're lying. And that's concerning because the prince is actually scared of his mom because she is part ogre. She's from a family of ogres. She's part ogress. And she has the instincts of an ogress, including the desire to hunt and eat children, which she doesn't do because she's a lady. She just wants to. And if you're wondering how this happened, don't worry, Perrault has an explanation as to how this came to be, which is that the king married her for her money. So the prince is like, maybe I won't tell my mom about this. So he continues to see the princess in secret for 2 years. And they have children together. They have a boy and a girl called Dawn and Day. I'm actually obsessed with those names. And so that's the first part of the story, the Sleeping Beauty story. And so now we go to the second half where the jealous queen tries to do some murder. So the prince's father, the king, dies. So now the prince is the king. And so now the princess is the queen, but also the old queen, the ogress queen, is still there. It's so hard when they don't have names. Perrault, can we please just give them names? So the king, the new king, is like, great, this is my moment. He publicly declares his marriage to everybody, gets his secret wife and 2 children, and moves them into the castle where the old queen is still living. So now they're all living together, the secret wife and the 2 kids and the mother. And the king is like, I gotta go.
In fact, I have to go.
I have to now immediately go to war. I need to go to war with this guy, Emperor Cantelabut. He leaves, and immediately ogre queen, the ogre-in-law, she's immediately like, well, I gotta eat these kids. I gotta eat them. She has her steward kill them and cook them for her. And he's like, I'm not gonna do that. So he hides them instead. And she is fooled at first, but then she finds out the truth. So she has the great, pit of vipers assembled. And she's like, I'm gonna throw you in the pit of vipers. But then finally the king comes home and he's like, well, this is no good. And the queen, the old queen, the ogre queen, realizes she's been found out. And so like she jumps into the pit of vipers. There's a lot going on. They live happily ever after. And then there's one more fairy tale version I want to look at. If we move up to the early 19th century with the most famous fairy tale collectors, the Brothers Grimm. They are actually German, so we're moving out of France for a little bit, but they are very influenced by Perrault, and their version of Sleeping Beauty is very influenced by Perrault's. This story is called Little Brier-Rose, and it goes like this. Once upon a time, there's a king and a queen, and they really want a kid so bad. And one day, the queen is walking past a pond, and she sees a fish on the bank of the pond, like gasping for air. And so she does it a solid and like tosses it back in the water. And the fish says, thank you so much. Let me give you a gift in return. You're gonna have a baby girl. And she did, if it works. The king and queen throw a big celebration when the baby is born, and they want to invite all of the fairies of the realm, and there are 13 fairies of the realm. But they only have 12 golden plates, so they don't invite one. But the 12 fairies they do invite pull up in amazing outfits. They are wearing red high-heeled shoes and red hats and carrying little magic wands. They bestow magical gifts upon the baby princess, including goodness, beauty, riches, and so on. Why would you think we wouldn't want to know what the gifts are? Whatever. And just before fairy number 12 gives her gift, oh my gosh, bursting through the door is the spurned fairy number 13. She has got black high-heeled shoes and a black hat and a broomstick. Hold on. She is really ticked off and she curses the princess that in her 15th year, she will prick her finger on a spindle and die. And everyone is upset about that. But then the last fairy, the 13th fairy, says, wait a minute, it won't be death. It will just be sleep for 100 years. And the king orders all of the spinning wheels to be burned. On the princess's 15th birthday, the king and queen are out. So the princess is playing by herself and exploring the castle, and she finds an old tower that she's like never explored before, and a door that opens with a golden key. And she goes in and goes up the stairs, and she sees an old woman spinning. And she's very curious because she's never seen this before. So she goes over and she checks it out and she pricks her finger and she falls on the ground. And if you're thinking that this old woman is the evil fairy in disguise, no, it's not. This is a random old woman that was spinning in a tower behind a door that closes with a golden key for no reason. I don't know where she got the spinning wheel. Yes, I did say all the spinning wheels were burned. I don't know. The princess falls down asleep, and then so does everybody else in the castle, and then a hedge of thorns grows around the castle. Presumably this is happening because of the fairy's intervention, but it doesn't really say, it just kind of happens. Word spreads that the beautiful princess Brier-Rose is asleep in her tower in this castle. This is where we get her name. A bunch of princes hear about this super beautiful princess that's like waiting to be woken by a prince, and they try to come get her and fail, and they like die from the thorns. After many, many years, a king's son hears of this tale. He hears about the beautiful princess and all of the princes that have died trying to save her, but he knows he's built different. So he sets out for the castle, and just then, that's when the 100 years are up. So he sees the castle, and it's actually covered by beautiful flowering shrubs. And he's like, well, this is super easy. And he just goes up, and they part for him, and he walks through the creepy castle of sleeping people, and he goes up to the tower, and he finds Brier-Rose. Brier-Rose is laying, just beautifully laid on a couch by the window. Don't ask me who put her on the couch, I don't know. And he goes over and he kisses her just as she wakes up. And everybody else wakes up, and the two of them get married, and they live happily ever after, the end. So this is very similar to the Perrault version, but of course we don't have that entire second half. We don't have the murderous, jealous queen, we don't have ogres, we don't have babies being cooked into pies. It's just the Sleeping Beauty part. And overall, it's shorter and there's less detail. It wasn't shorter because I was skipping a bunch of stuff. It really is a shorter story. And here we have the first time the kiss, the true love's kiss that breaks the curse. Except I'm not sure we do. I'm not sure that the kiss actually breaks the curse. Like, he kisses her and she wakes up, but I'm not sure that that's causal. It says, quote, he stooped down and gave her a kiss, but the moment he kissed her, she opened her eyes and awoke. The but there seems to imply to me that one did not cause the other, that like actually she was waking because the 100 years were over and he was like there, but he didn't need to kiss her to make it happen. I think maybe the nuance would be more clear if I read this in the original German. But from this translation, I think you can make the case that the kiss didn't actually make a difference, that he didn't need to be doing all that. So that's our source material, right? Those are the tales that become Disney's Sleeping Beauty. Disney's Sleeping Beauty actually says that it's based on the Perrault version, The Sleeping Beauty in the Woods, but you can see pretty easily that there are elements from the later Brothers Grimm version that make it into the final product. Things like the name Brier-Rose, or the true love's kiss breaking the spell, maybe, or the fact that the princess's parents make it to the end of the movie and don't die during the sleep. But it all gets a little confusing because really, Disney's Sleeping Beauty is based on the Tchaikovsky Ballet from 1889.
For inspiration for Sleeping Beauty, this wonderful score written more than 75 years ago by Peter Tchaikovsky for his ballet version of the Fairytale,
which was originally intended to be based on the Perrault version, but also started cribbing things from the Grimm's version. But there's also new stuff in the ballet. There are changes and additions that are original to the ballet that are then used in the Disney version. So yes, we do also have to recap the ballet. Once upon a time, there's a king and a queen, and they hold a big christening celebration for their first child, Princess Aurora. And they invite 7 fairies who come and give gifts to the princess of beauty, sweetness, courage, music, and mischief. But just before the last one, and that's the Lilac Fairy, she's the most powerful, just before the Lilac Fairy can give her gift, oh no, an evil fairy called Carabosse arrives. Carabosse is pissed off, and she's like, did you forget to invite me? And the king and queen are both like, not me, I didn't forget you. And they blame the master of ceremonies, Cantalabut, no relation, and she does the only thing you can do and grabs his wig and beats him with her staff, and then decides it's her turn to give a gift to baby Aurora. She says the princess will grow up beautiful and graceful, but when she turns 16, she will prick her finger on a spindle and die. The Lilac Fairy has held back, and now she comes back out and says, I still have a gift to give, and she amends the curse. She says, yes, Aurora will prick her finger, but die? No, not die, just sleep. And then, after 100 years, a guy will come from somewhere, and he will kiss her, and she'll wake up. Then we jump forward in time for the next act. It is Aurora's 16th birthday. Celebrations are being prepared, and somehow Cantalabut still has a job, and the king is really on edge, and he finds out these women have been spinning with spindles, and he's like, I'm gonna absolutely lose it. But the queen is like, can you please calm down? It's a party. Then Aurora comes in, and she is presented with 4 suitors for her hand, and she seems to be enjoying herself. She's obviously too pretty for any of them, but she seems to be partial to one of them, who has a real choice of an outfit. And then a stranger in a cloak enters and presents a gift. And what is it? It's a spindle! And everybody freaks out, but Aurora doesn't care. She's like, this is the best gift I've ever gotten in my life. You can't take it from me. And then she pricks her finger. And oh no, but oh, wait, she's fine? Oh, no, wait, she's going down. Now you might think that this cloaked stranger is actually the evil Carabosse in disguise. And you'd be right! It is! But the Lilac Fairy is here to remind everyone that she has it under control, so they take Aurora and put her in a bed, and then the Lilac Fairy puts the whole kingdom to sleep, including the king and queen, and thorns grow around the castle. And then we jump forward again. We jump forward 100 years, and Prince Desiree is out hunting. And it seems like he already has a lady, which is a little troubling, but I can't even be mad because look at her outfit. They're all in these amazing 18th century riding habits with tiny little hats. The prince doesn't want to play games with everybody else, and they're acting like he's being unreasonable and broody and withdrawn for no reason, but the game in question is putting on a blindfold and being beat with sticks. So I don't know if that's on him. But to be fair, he is being broody, and he goes off on his own to think his deep thoughts. He's like, take my coat and leave. My sleeves need room to billow if I'm gonna properly brood. And he runs into the Lilac Fairy, and he's like, I'm sad. And she's like, I know something that would make you feel better. Would you like to see something beautiful? And shows him a vision of Aurora. And the prince is like, she's so hot. And the Lilac Fairy is like, I know, right? And conjures an illusion of Aurora for him to dance with. And they dance, and they have fabulous chemistry, even better than the guy with the weird outfit. And Aurora is like, wanna come hang? And he's like, of course, but he can't. Why?
'Cause she's dead.
And Aurora is like, fun fact, my legs can do this. And he's like, I need to wife this woman immediately. And the Lilac Fairy is like, great, get in, let's go. And she takes him to the castle and makes the forest of brambles part for him, and he goes up to the tower, and Carabosse tries to stop them, but she doesn't do a good job. She doesn't put up much of a fight, so the fairy defeats her very easily. And the prince finds Aurora, and he's like, oh my gosh, she's sleeping. What do I do? And the Lilac Fairy is like, can we use our brains for 1 minute? And he's like, oh, I forgot, I need to kiss her. And he does, and she wakes up, and the rest of the kingdom wakes up, and hooray. Act 3 is Aurora and the prince's wedding celebration, and all the other fairy tale characters are invited. It's adorable. The end. So the ballet is way more similar to the Disney version than anything else we've seen. You have some smaller details, like the idea that it's Aurora's 16th birthday, that she's named Aurora at all, the clarity that you have a kiss that definitely breaks the curse, kind of the characterization of the prince, but mostly you have the overarching plot of the Lilac Fairy versus the evil fairy. Aurora and the prince are theoretically the leads of this ballet, and they definitely have the most to do as far as dancing goes, but from a story structure perspective, Aurora, adult Aurora, doesn't show up until like a third of the way through the ballet, and the prince doesn't show up until almost halfway through the ballet. The only one who's there the whole time is the lilac fairy. She is present not only throughout the length of the ballet, but she is physically there for all of the important moments in the story. And the whole story is restructured around this frame of this battle between good and evil that is happening at the level of the supernatural. And all of this petty human drama is happening underneath that. Looking back at all the versions I recapped, the villain and the heroic fairy just keep getting more and more to do. And the prince gets like a little more to do. The princess's father gets a little more to do. But nobody really seems to care all that much about the Sleeping Beauty. So when it comes time for Disney to take a swing at this story, this is what they're working with. This is the source material that they're pulling from as the raw material that they can make choices about what they highlight, what they change, what they preserve. In the early years of the Disney Animation Studios, those kinds of story decisions got a lot of attention. There was a lot of time spent on choosing how to take the raw material of a fairy tale and turn it into something that works on the screen, that works in the medium of animation, that speaks to the specific time and place where the film was being produced. The books I've read that cover this period in the company history often frame it as a great frustration for the writers and especially the animators that are developing this movie, that there was such a demand from Walt Disney to just develop the heck out of this thing. Those early films were the result of hours and hours of story meetings at the high big picture level about how the story would work, what these characters would be like. Many different versions of Snow White existed at one point in development with very different appearance and personality that could have been in the final product, but they kept developing and they moved past it. Aurora, not so much, because the film Sleeping Beauty as a whole was made much quicker than previous films. Sleeping Beauty still took a long time to make, especially to animate, but in the stage of story development, it was fast-tracked compared to previous Disney projects. And Walt Disney himself, who used to be very involved with the story meetings, was doing other stuff by this point. He was off doing his theme park. So this raw material from the fairy tales and the ballet became a film script much quicker than comparable Disney films.
Earlier films, you can tell from story meetings that there was a tremendous amount of refining, of reworking, going over the stuff over and over again to purify it as much as possible. Sleeping Beauty, you can't see that. Sleeping Beauty seems to have been pretty much the way it turned out from the very early.
And the writers and artists behind this adaptation started to do what most creatives do when they are faced with an unmeetable deadline. They started digging through the trash can. They weren't sure what these characters ought to look like and move like and sound like, and they weren't sure what scenes needed to be in the movie or needed to be cut. So they started recycling. They started looking at things that had been cut from other projects that they could maybe reuse. And this is why I say there is one more important piece of source material for Disney's Snow White, besides the fairy tales and the ballet. Another important piece of source material for Sleeping Beauty are Snow White and Cinderella. Listen, Disney likes to present itself as a very innovative company, and it has done a lot of innovation over the course of its history. And it's done a lot of recycling. It's done a lot of reheating its own nachos. Disney only knows how to make like 4 different movies. It just makes them over and over. It just finds one that works and makes that as many times as possible until people start hating it. Especially when it's having financial problems. Disney's go-to move is always going to be playing the hits, and its biggest hit was always going to be Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. You can argue that Cinderella, and especially Sleeping Beauty, are remakes of Snow White, more than anything else, more than they're even adaptations of other fairy tales. Not just because of surface similarities in the fairy tales, which are of kind of similar origin, and they have, you know, the damsel saved by the prince and stuff, but also because of how similar they are in execution. The team behind Sleeping Beauty needed some more scenes. And oh look, there's one on the cutting room floor from Snow White, where the evil queen holds the prince captive in her castle as part of her evil plan. That would work. They're not sure what the evil queen should look like. How should her face be? Well, I guess they could do this like really pale face and give her a sort of hood cowl situation covering her neck. How is she supposed to dress? Well, there's some old concept art of Cinderella's fairy godmother, and she's got long flowing robes and a headdress that kind of has this horn. Take that, combine it with the costume from the ballet. There's your Maleficent. They have a lot of animation to do, and it's very time consuming, but they already animated this sequence of Cinderella and her prince waltzing through clouds, and it never got used, so it'd be an awful waste. And that's how Sleeping Beauty got out there so quick. Not to discount the talent and the hard work of the artists and writers, they also did put in a crazy number of hours working really hard, doing great creative work. But that only gets you part of the way. The rest of the way was recycling. And when they're busy doing all that, no one really has time to address the biggest issue with their source material, which is that they don't know who Sleeping Beauty is or what she does. And that was identified as a problem early on. Apparently, the writers saw that this character didn't have a lot going on, and they thought she was bland. And that was bringing down the whole story. It made the whole story feel kind of dull. Everybody knew it was a problem, and they never fixed it. And you have to imagine if they had given Aurora the amount of time they had been able to give to Snow White or Cinderella, maybe they would have had some breakthrough. But they were stuck on Aurora, and in the absence of Walt Disney's leadership to force them to figure her out, everybody involved on the project just kind of started working on other things. They started giving their attention to Maleficent, who was really, really exciting, or the prince, who could maybe have more stuff going on, and especially the good fairies.
Walt actually wanted the fairies to be all very similar. He wanted almost a Huey, Dewey, and Louie thing.
When the story department had stalled out on what the fairies should be like, the art department came through and figured out a visual identity for the fairies that was specifically based on real life. The animators went to grocery stores and observed older women shopping, the way they moved, how they carried themselves, how they looked, the different ways they carried their weight. And they very directly based the fairies on those real women. And suddenly, from just the visual design alone, the fairies had life. They had a vitality that even Maleficent and the prince didn't necessarily have, because those were faraway fantasy characters. The fairies were real.
Fauna came from a person that Frank met in Colorado.
Oh dear, I don't seem to be able to find this, but I have a letter here from my cousin Susie who says some very interesting things I think you'll be interested in. So she read the letter from her cousin Susie. And I said, there's our character.
That was the breakthrough, making the fairies real, realizing they didn't have to be like the other good fairy characters that the company had made before. Characters like the Blue Fairy or Cinderella's fairy godmother, who are sort of perfectly, serenely good and have this vast, powerful magic that they bestow benevolently upon the deserving hero. What if, even though they have wings and magic wands, they were kind of human? They were people with frustrations and aspirations and likes and dislikes and emotion. What if they could make mistakes and then learn from them? What if they could experience setbacks and then overcome them? That's the kind of stuff that drives a story. That's the kind of stuff a protagonist does. I mean, try to imagine this story from Aurora's point of view. Try to retell this strictly in Aurora's point of view. Once upon a time, I was living in a cute little cottage with my 3 aunts. It was my 16th birthday, and they shooed me out of the house so that they could plan some sort of surprise, and I went to go frolic in the woods, which I love to do. I was telling my woodland critter friends about the man that I see in my dreams, and just as I'm saying this, I run into a man. I run into this man in the woods, and I'm very nervous at first, and I'm not supposed to talk to strangers, but he's persistent and he's charming, and I realize this might be the man from my dreams. I have to go home.
In fact, I have to go.
But I tell him he can call on me later at the cottage. And when I arrive home, I see that my aunties have made a big cake and a gorgeous dress for my birthday, but all I can think about is the man, and I tell them about him, and they're not happy for me. They tell me I can't see this man anymore because secretly I've been a princess the whole time and I am engaged to some prince, so I can't see him again, and now I have to immediately leave my home and go to some castle. They dress me up like a princess and put me in this creepy tower room, and then the next thing I know, I'm in some sort of trance. I've been magically enchanted to go up to a tower, and I prick my finger on the spindle of a spinning wheel, and then the next thing I know, I'm in a bed. I'm waking up, and the man is in front of me. It turns out that the man I met in the woods, the man I'd been dreaming about, is the same person as the prince that I've been engaged to. So I come into the court, and I meet my parents, and I dance with my prince, and we live happily ever after. A lot of crazy stuff happened to her, but I'm not sure this is her story.
Her story? Her story.
We can try to retell it from the point of view of the prince, Philip, and you know what? That's a little more like a story. Once upon a time, my dad took me to a birthday party. His friend had a baby girl, so I bring a gift to her, and then a lot of weird stuff happens at this party that honestly it's unclear if I was present for or not. 16 years later, I'm riding through the woods and I hear this beautiful voice, and I follow it to this beautiful young woman, and we talk, and she's beautiful, and I charm her, and we dance together, and then she wants to go, but I do get her to promise that I can see her again. I'm gonna call on her later at the cottage in the glen. I am in love with this woman. I even tell my dad that she's the woman I'm going to marry, and he's not happy for me, but that's not really my problem. So I go to call on her at the cottage, and she's not there. Instead, I get ambushed by these goblins and a witch. She's Maleficent, and presumably I've heard of her, and she takes me back to her castle and starts gloating about this princess that's under a curse and only I can break it, but I'm here. And it turns out that this princess is also the girl I met in the woods. After just a short time, these 3 fairies come, and they have a lot of magic, so they use it to break me out of the cell, and they give me a sword and shield, and lead me to my horse, and clear the way for me to get away from the castle. They fight off Maleficent's minions, and give my horse the power to fly practically, and then when Maleficent transforms into a dragon, they use my sword to kill the dragon. Finally, I arrive at the castle where I went to that weird birthday party 16 years ago, and I go up to a tower, and there is Aurora sleeping, and I bend down to kiss her, and she wakes up. We go see our parents, and they're happy with how this all worked out, and we dance and live happily ever after. You'll notice he gets a lot of help that feels kind of inexplicable. And that doesn't mean he's not a protagonist. That happens in lots of stories, but you know, it does make you wonder if maybe he's not the main character here. Let's take it back one more time and try to tell this from the point of view of our 3 good fairies. Once upon a time, we were respected fairies of the court of King Stephen and his queen, and we came to give our magical gifts to the new baby princess Aurora. We gave her beauty and song, but before we could give her the last gift, Maleficent shows up. Maleficent is also really magically powerful, but she's unpleasant to be around, so we didn't invite her. But she took that really personally. She's really mad at us about it, and she puts a curse on the innocent, sweet baby princess Aurora that she will prick her finger and die when she's 16, and that's horrible, and we have to stop it, but we don't have the kind of magic that can totally undo the curse. What we figure out we can do is amend the curse, so instead of dying, Aurora will just go into an enchanted sleep that can be woken by true love's first kiss. And that's better, but it's still not ideal. The king is freaking out, he has all of the spinning wheels burned, and we have a conference to try to figure out how we can keep Aurora safe from Maleficent. Even if this curse doesn't work out, it's clear that Maleficent wants to hurt the baby, and we have to stop her. It's our job to help protect the royal family. We always rely on our magic, but we realize that that isn't working this time, so we come up with a totally new idea to temporarily forego using all magic so that we can be hidden from Maleficent's spies, and we can take baby Aurora and hide her somewhere safe. We'll go to a cottage in the woods, and we will raise her like our own. The king and queen aren't happy about this, but they know it's a good idea, so they let us take Aurora, and for 16 years, we raise her from a baby to a beautiful teenager in our little cottage. It's hard to go without magic, but we do it. We keep Aurora safe and hidden for 16 years, and on her 16th birthday, it's very emotional. We're happy for her, but also sad that she'll be moving out, so we decide to have a great celebration. We're going to make her a beautiful gown and bake a big cake. But we never did get the hang of doing these fancy kind of things without magic, so at the last minute, we break. We take our eye off the ball and we get out the magic wands so that we can have the perfect birthday for our beloved Aurora. The cake and the dress turn out beautifully, but when Aurora comes back home, she doesn't seem to care about them. All she wants to talk about is this man she met in the woods. I recognize this look. Girl's got crazy eyes, and we need to step in now. And we just come out and tell Aurora that she can't see this man anymore because actually she already has a man she's betrothed to. We finally tell her who she really is and that today she'll have to go back to live in the castle. And we always thought she'd be happy, but she's devastated and it's horrible. We give her some space because this is all a lot, but Maleficent uses that moment as her opportunity to enchant Aurora and make her go prick her finger on the spindle of a spinning wheel. And we don't get there in time, and she falls into the enchanted sleep. We can't believe we let this happen to Aurora. It was our mistakes that made it go down this way. And we also know that the king and queen are going to be devastated. So we decide to kick the can down the road. We don't want to tell them what happened, so instead we will put them into an enchanted sleep as well. Just as we are putting the royals to sleep, we hear one of them muttering about the fact that Prince Philip was talking about being in love with some peasant he met in the woods, that they were dancing together once upon a dream. And we remember that this is exactly what Aurora said about the man she met in the woods. If they're the same person, that means that Prince Philip is already in love with Aurora. And that means if he kisses her, it would break the spell. We decide that we will save Aurora by bringing Prince Philip to her. So we go back to the cottage where Prince Philip was going to call on Aurora, but he's gone. It looks like Maleficent got him. So we have to go to her castle, the scariest place we can imagine, but we're going to do it for Aurora. To go up against Maleficent. This has been a long time coming, so we use all of our magic to break Philip out of his cell. We fight off Maleficent's henchmen, we use our magic to counteract her magic, we fight through the briars that have hidden the castle, and finally, when Maleficent pulls out her last trick and transforms into a dragon, we use Philip's sword to stab her in the heart and kill her once and for all. We take Philip back to the tower where we left Aurora, and he kisses her and she wakes up, so we wake up the rest of the kingdom, and they're all reunited. The whole royal family is safe and happy at last. And we all lived happily ever after.
I just love happy endings.
Now that is shaped like a story. That looks like a story. I think some people might be tempted to overlook the fairies as potential protagonists because there's 3 of them, but they're sort of operating as one, and our idea of a protagonist is definitely a singular individual. But I think you can conceptualize them almost as one character, just with 3 sort of aspects to a personality. I mean, consider why there are 3 of them at all, because there wouldn't have to be. You could do the story the same way with just one good fairy, and that's practically what the ballet does. There are good fairies around at the beginning, at the christening, but they don't do much. It's really the Lilac Fairies show. Disney was already downsizing on fairies, going from 13 or 7 down to 3. Why didn't they just go down to 1? My opinion, and I don't know if this is what the writers were consciously thinking, but when I look at this movie, I see having multiple fairies functioning the same way that animal sidekicks function in a lot of Disney movies. we, the audience, can know what she's thinking and feeling because she's saying it out loud to the animal. The fact that there are multiple fairies forces conversation. Even if they're always in agreement, somebody has to say out loud what the plan is, and then we, the audience, get clued in on the plan. But they actually don't always agree, at least not at first. They have slight differences of opinion or perspective or personality that make things feel a little more alive, a little more dynamic, a little more, again, realistic, human, and fallible, and quirky. That's the answer. The good fairies are the protagonist, or protagonists, of Sleeping Beauty. Are we satisfied with that? I'm not. I've watched a lot of movies in my time, like at least 8. And if you have watched dozens or even hundreds of movies in your life, there's a good chance that you're very attuned to small, minute differences between films, but it can be easy to take it for granted the ways that they are similar. Okay, like all artistic mediums, film has conventions and norms that usually you don't notice until they are broken. I'm getting a little highfalutin here. I'm trying to tee up the question. Why are we so sure this movie has a protagonist? Are we sure that every movie has one? Are we sure that every movie should have one? A lot of discussion around film, especially around script writing and story, rests on the assumption, the completely unspoken assumption, that not only is every film built around a protagonist, but that a stronger protagonist, a more protagonisty protagonist, makes a better story. A strong protagonist drives the story forward with deliberate choices that logically follow from their powerful motivation, and they have explicit wants and they have implicit needs, and their choices force the story and the story forces their growth. Your basic conventional writing advice is all about how to do this. Like, it's not about whether to do this, it's about how to do this, how to write the strongest protagonist possible, how to conform the protagonist's journey into that 3-act structure.
We can take these beats, which are basically the beats of your outline, and if the words "and then" belong between those beats, you're f***ed. No, it should be this happens, and therefore this happens. This to that, to this to that, but this, here's the complication, to that.
In capital G good writing, events form a perfect chain of logical cause and effect. If outside forces or happenstance impacts the story too much, that is a failure of storytelling.
You see movies that you're just watching, it's like, this happened, and then this happens, and then this happened. That's not a story, but because, therefore, that gives you the causation between each beat, and that makes that's a story.
But you know what? Sometimes stuff just happens to you. Most of life is not your grand narrative. Most of life is just a thing happens, and then another thing happens, and then another thing happens, and maybe that doesn't make for satisfying narrative. Okay, that's your real life. Maybe you don't want stories to work that way. Maybe there's a reason that we don't create works that work that way, especially in longer works like novels and films. But you know what stories do work that way? Fairy tales. Okay? In life, stuff just happens sometimes that has nothing to do with anything. And if you want a story that's going to be honest about that, you want a fairy tale. This is partly because that's just what folklore is like. Any stories that are short stories that are told and retold, passed down orally, told especially to children, are naturally going to be very silly.
These stories are made up around the fire in the dead of winter in Germany, where you can't leave your house for 3 months and you're just trying to get your children to fall asleep. Those don't make any sense.
But it's also because fairy tales are stories of magic, or more specifically, stories that take place in a world of magic. Fairy tales are not portal fantasies where someone from an ordinary world is thrust into a land of enchantment. It's not a story where somebody living in an ordinary world is suddenly gifted with magic. They are stories in a world where magic is and was and will be. And as stories set in worlds of magic, they should reflect humility towards the forces of good and evil and fate and magic that shape people's lives in ways that are totally out of the control of any one human. Marina Warner, a cultural historian who has written a ton about fairy tales, says that magic is a necessary component in what a fairy tale is, not just because of the content or the topic of the story, but because of the form, because of the way the story works. Classic fairy tales, deploying wonders and inspiring astonishment, depend on magic as causation. Magic is part of the fabric of everyday reality, which is permeated with invisible forces moved by magical beings, who mostly act beyond the protagonist's reach, and spring continual surprises, behave capriciously, and create unforeseeable effects, which contradict the laws of physics, logic, and probability. The laws of nature are disregarded, and the plots work instead according to the laws of enchantment.
Sometimes when you're directing a sequence, logic might take a back seat to emotion.
How he got through the thorns or how his horse ever got up there, they used to criticize that thing when I showed it first. It didn't need the logic. You didn't have time to think. That thing was driving at you all the time.
We spend all day, every day, trying to make sense of things, trying to order all of our sensory input into neat, logical information, trying to fit our experiences and relationships and feelings into familiar shapes and patterns. What if we just took a break for 1 minute? What if for 1 minute we relieved ourselves of that demand and surrendered to the forces of enchantment? Just for a minute. Stuff just happens and people just do things, and maybe the story doesn't need to be about why. It doesn't need to be about the childhood trauma or great master plan or twisted mind that made that person do what they did. Maybe in this story, they just do it and then we're on to the next thing, and it's not our job to make sense of it. It is only our job to experience it. Fantasy author Philip Pullman has said that there is no psychology in a fairy tale. The tremors and mysteries of human awareness, the whispers of memory, the promptings of half-understood regret or doubt or desire that are so much part of the subject matter of the modern novel are absent entirely. One might almost say that the characters in a fairy tale are not actually conscious. What if that's the standard to which we hold Disney's Aurora? She is a native of Fairytale land. She is not the captain of her own character development. She's a princess. And she does princess things because she's a princess, and she does a great job. She is lovely and charming and important. The story is driven by her mere existence and presence. All this is because of her. This is Aurora's story because it's about what happens to her. To her. The tension at the center of the film is whether she will make it to her happy ending. She starts out one way, a baby. She starts out one way, and then, oh no, it looks like things might go bad for her, but there's hope. And then hope prevails, and she lives happily ever after. I guess you could make this story shorter if you wanted to. If you followed the proper conventional writing advice, you would probably have to, because not every scene drives the plot or reveals character the way you're supposed to. But why would you want to skip any of this? Aren't we having a good time? Isn't it beautiful to look at? Funny? And exciting? And a little scary sometimes? And isn't the music great? And why can't that be enough? Why can't that actually be admirable? If a movie like that were released today, a movie that was confident and joyful in being a true fairy tale, I think that would be revolutionary. In that same piece, Philip Pullman suggests that the true nature of a fairy tale character is best represented not by film or dance or even illustrations in a book, but by paper puppets. Those paper puppets on a stick, that you use in a little toy theater, they are flat, not round. Only one side of them is visible to the audience, but that is the side we need. The other side is blank. They are depicted in poses of intense activity or passion, so that their part in the drama can easily be read from a distance. Calling a character flat is supposed to be a bad thing, right? Maybe sometimes they're supposed to be. And looking at Disney movies, specifically at the history of their animated fairy tale retellings, it's hard not to see some accidental resonance in the suggestion that 2 dimensions is the natural form of fairy tale. That these princes and princesses and dragons and witches belong flat on paper. Maybe they're not meant to be pushed into a three-dimensional world. Just something to think about. Now, you may be wondering, where is the good fairy? Where is that young fairy who gave the princess the last gift? And don't worry, Perrault knows you're wondering that. He has your back. He's going to tell you. The good fairy who had saved her life by dooming her to sleep for 100 years was in the kingdom of Mataquin, 12,000 leagues away, when the accident happened to the princess. But the news was soon brought to her by a little dwarf who had 7-league boots, so that he could go 7 leagues at each step. The fairy started off directly, and before an hour was over, she had arrived in her chariot of fire, drawn by dragons. None of this has been mentioned before. None of it will be mentioned again. It doesn't seem to matter in any way, but Perrault thought we should know, so I thought you should know. And the moral of this story, according to Perrault, is really, really long. Many a girl has waited long for a husband, brave or strong, but I'm sure I never met any sort of woman yet who could wait 100 years, free from fretting, free from fears. Now our story seems to show that a century or so, late or early, matters not. True love comes by fairy lot. Some old folk will even say it grows better by delay. Yet this good advice, I fear, helps us neither there nor here. Though philosophers may prate, how much wiser 'tis to wait. Maids will be a sighing still. Young blood must when young blood will.